for working. Okay, so interpreter basically translate a statement in a program one by one. Okay, but it execute that line immediately before translating the next source statement. It goes to the first line, like this is a I can say that this is a first line of code. Okay, so it will go to that line first, it will execute that line, and then goes to the second line. In compiler reads the whole code. Compiler first read the whole code and search for syntax error. Then it will translate the code into machine code, but interpreter did not do that. So when an error is encountered, the execution of program is halted. Okay, and error message is displayed. Whenever it gets error, it will stop executing your program and gives you an error. It will go by statement and statement and statement. So what do you think, which translator takes more time to convert our code into machine code, compiler or interpreter? Hello? Hello? Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you.
Okay, I ask a question that which translator takes more time to convert our source code into machine code, compiler or interpreter?
Interpreter, because it goes line by line.
Yes, because it goes line by line and it will stop whenever it encounters an error. Okay, it will take more time. But instead, the compiler just read the whole source code. Your whole code, it reads your whole code, check for error, then gives you an error. Okay, error message. While it will go line by line, interpreter will go from one line to another line, then to another line, and when it gets an error, it will give you an error message. These languages that uses interpreter are basic and Lisp, and these languages have their own interpreters. Okay, they does not use any external software to execute. Okay, high level language first translate and execute statement by statement. The difference is that between interpreter and compiler is that compiler reads the whole source code first, but the interpreter goes from statement to statement, translate, execute, translate, execute, translate, execute. Then it will go to the error message. If it does not have any error, it will give you result of executed statement. So here is the difference between interpreter and compiler. Can you differentiate any point regarding the difference between a compiler or interpreter?
A compiler has it comes with an object code at the end, but
Okay.
the interpreter doesn't.
Good. Okay. Let's come to the differences between compiler and interpreter on the basis of object code, translation process, debugging ease, implementation, and execution time. When we talk about object code, a compiler provides a separate object program. Okay, it will give you a separate machine code that will save separately and can be run on its own, like we have studied in the previous slides. A compiler will provide us with a machine code which has a separate complete file that will be saved in memory location, and we can use it whenever we want to use it, we'll just click on it. Okay, whereas an interpreter does not generate a permanent object code file. It does not give you any object file that is separate from the source code. It will just convert source code immediately by translating line by line and then executing that line of code. There's a difference on the basis of object code. Okay, now let's come to the translation process. It converts the entire program into machine code at one go. Like you said before, the machine code reads the whole program first and looks for the syntax error. If there is no error, it will read the whole code and turn that whole code into the machine code in one go. Okay, whereas the interpreter translate the source code line wise. It goes to the first line of your code. When it begin translating, it goes to the first line of code, translate it, then execute it, then goes to the second, translate it and execute it, and so on. Okay, so now let's come to the third point, that is debugging ease. Removal of error in compiler. The removal of error is basically called debugging. Okay, is slow in compiler. Okay, first you need to go to the line and check it that, whereas in interpreter debugging becomes easier because the error points out immediately. What does it mean by that statement, that error points out immediately? How does that happen? Can you tell me?
Because the interpreter goes line by line.
Yes.
When it comes to an error, it stops straight away.
Okay. Yes, definitely. It goes from line by line, and whenever it encounters an error, it stops right there and gives you a beep or a message that there is an error. You need to remove that error. So you remove error. You remove the error in a sequence, instead of you get all the errors together and you look at those errors. So you need to find that error first, go to that line and remove that error, then goes to the second line of code, third, fourth, fifth, in a sequence. So removal of error in compiler is slower as compared to the interpreter, because interpreter points out error immediately. Okay, now come to the implementation. What is meant by implementation? Hello?
Can you repeat what you said?
I ask what is meant by implementation?
How easy you can use the two translators.
Implementation is basically to apply something as you want to apply on something. Like you want to use a chair. Okay, like you want to use a chair, you want to use a chair to sit. How comfortably you can sit on it is up to you. Like you need cushions and or the foaming to the sides or to the back. This is basically implementing a thought, okay, to apply something according to your need. Okay, so implementation is basically, compilers are a complex programs. Compilers are not very easy to use. You need to understand the working environment of compilers before you can work with the compilers. They require hardcore coding. It does not work with the simple line of code. It requires hardcore coding. It will use complex code to understand and then translate it accordingly. Also requires more memory to execute a program. So there are 3 points for compiler when it comes to the implementation. First thing is that Compilers are complex program. Okay, these are complex program. It has complex line of coding, very complex logics that are implemented inside the compiler, so they work accordingly and gives you the output. Okay, and they require hardcore coding, means efficient coding, efficient code that will be implemented and translated inside the compiler. Okay, also require more memory to execute a program. Why does it require more memory? Because when you are writing a code, a line of code, a complex code consists of many lines. Okay, many lines or very complex logic that requires computations more, that will require more time to perform a computation. Okay, so when it requires more time to compute, it will use more methods to get the output. When it use more methods to get the output, it will require more memory to execute that program. So these are the three main points of compilers when it comes to the implementation. Now come to the interpreter. Interpreter are easier to write because they are less complex program, also requires less memory of for program execution. Why are they easier? Because interpreters works by statement and statement. They do not need to go through the whole code and understand the logic of the developer and then perform some execution. Okay, then implement it. They do not need to implement the whole code all together, because when the compiler is started implementing the whole code, whole source code of a developer, it needs to understand the thinking of developer. It needs to understand which function do what. It needs to understand which function comes first according to precedences. Okay, while interpreter goes statements by statement, it does not need to understand the whole code altogether. Okay, it just goes by statement and statement and then understand, okay, do this, implement this, print name. Okay, print name. It does not go to print name and then save it to that. It just goes by print name, then okay, save button, then save the name. It goes by statement, so it does not require more memory to implement more methods than as compared to compilers. Now let's come to the execution time. Execution time. Compilers are faster as compared to interpreters because each statement is translated only once and saved in object file, which can be executed anytime without translating again. Execution time is basically how fast compiler will give you an output. Okay, how fast compiler debug your program and then convert into machine code and then gives you an output. So compilers are faster than that of interpreters. Compilers are faster because they translated the whole program all together and save an object file separately. So it does not have to compile the file again and again. It just goes to or reference to the memory location where that object file or machine code of our source code is saved, and just run it by the simple click on it. Okay, it does not have to go again, compile that and then give you the output. It will just save first, it will translate your program one time. Translation will be happen and the object file will use again and again. Okay, and without any translating again, we can execute within fraction of time. Okay, now come to the interpreter. Interpreters slower as compared to the compilers because each statement is translated every time when it is executing the source code. So first thing is clear is that it does not give you any object code separately. Why? Because it have to read the statement one by one. it will goes to the first line of code, then it will go to the second, then third. It will not save these object codes that it is translating in a separate file so that it can used in future. It will not give you anything that can be used in future. You have to compile or interpret that program again and again to get your desired output, and when it goes from statement to statement, it will take more time, whereas compiler read out the whole source code at once. Okay, now come to the simple C program. C language is basically a when you go to university, if you choose software engineering or computer sciences or IT, the first thing, introduction to programming course that they provide you with is that C language course. They start with C language course, and then it will and then they goes to the other languages, and it is up to you by the end of your degree that whether you want to go to the software development, web development, or web based application, that is web based software development. So if you are very bright or very present minded person, you can go into the software development. Software development is more complex. Okay, web development is not that complex. You can easily write your code in web development, so we start with the web development. So this is just an example to tell you how does the development environment works. C language is basically high level language, and it use compiler. The compiler that used to compile C program is Borland. Okay, and the mainly used right now is Visual Studio, Microsoft Visual Studio, that we will be using in our next session to write some web development codes. Okay, so phases of C program is that first thing is editor. Program is created in the editor. Editor is your uh, compiler. The first phase, compiler has first phase which provides you with the editor. I'll show you at the end of all these slides what is compiler and how does it work. Okay, program is created in editor and stored on the disk. In editor you write your code and it will be saved into disk. Preprocessor program processes the code. Preprocessor is basically a a basic input already defined environment that allows your program to run on multiple different type of machines. Preprocessor preprocess your already process your code so that your code will run on different machines. It will add more functionality to your code. Okay, so we have less than 1 minute. We will come back to that same meeting on the same link. Okay, so preprocessor program processes the code, and then it sends your code that is already pre-processed and already turned into code that will be running on multiple different type of machines, will be sent to compiler. So the compiler compiles an object code and stores on disk, that is the memory location. Like I said, like we have studied in the previous slides, that compiler gives you an extra file of object code that will be stored on disk. Okay, hopefully you like my video. Kindly subscribe my channel.